How dare you bring that child here? Give him to me now! Please, no, he's just a boy! You have no right!
Get that child out of my sight, Clara. And if he's still in this house when Ethan gets home, I will personally see to it that you never clean another toilet in this city again. When Clara Reyes took a housekeeping job at the Whitmore estate, she brought with her a secret that could unravel everything her 2-year-old nephew Noah, the son her late sister left behind, and the son that billionaire Ethan Whitmore never knew he had. Ethan's fiancée, Vivian Alcott, suspects the truth, and what she does about it one afternoon while Ethan is away will be caught on camera in ways she never anticipated. Clara has spent 2 years protecting Noah from the very family whose blood he carries. But silence has a price, and the bill is coming due. The house that smiles with clenched teeth. The Whitmore estate sat behind iron gates on a street where the hedges were trimmed to the exact same height on both sides, and every house looked like it had never once been caught off guard. Clara Reyes had been working here for 11 days. She knew which floorboards creaked near the east staircase, which of the 3 dishwashers ran quietest, and that the vase in the front foyer, white porcelain with blue veins running through it like a bruise, cost more than 6 months of her salary. She had learned not to look at it directly. What she had not planned for on the morning of the 12th day was the phone call at 6:47 that told her the daycare center had a burst pipe and would be closed until further notice. Clara stood in the small staff quarters on the ground floor with her phone pressed to her ear, and she looked at Noah, asleep in the portable crib she'd wedged between the dresser and the wall. He was curled on his side, one fist pressed to his cheek, his breathing so even and unhurried that it seemed to belong to a different world than the one she was standing in. He was 2 years and 3 months old. He had his mother's eyes, large and dark and set wide apart, and when he laughed, which was often and without warning, it made Clara feel like something was being held back from breaking. She had felt that way since the day she took him from the hospital, and she did not expect the feeling to stop anytime soon. She texted her supervisor, Mrs. Gale, who managed the household staff, and explained the situation. Mrs. Gale's reply came back in 4 minutes. "Bring him in. Keep him quiet. Miss Alcott leaves by 10. It was not permission so much as an instruction shaped like a favor, and Clara understood the difference. She dressed Noah in the dark blue outfit that made him look less like a child who had spent the night on a cot and more like a child on a planned visit, gave him his sippy cup and a handful of dry cereal, and carried him through the side entrance before anyone in the main house was awake. The morning passed without incident. Noah sat in the kitchen with Clara while she prepped the breakfast service content with his cereal and a small board book she'd tucked into her bag. He was, by some grace Clara had never taken for granted, a quiet child. He watched things carefully before deciding how to feel about them. The kitchen staff moved around him with the efficient indifference of people who had seen stranger things, and by 8:15 the breakfast trays had gone up and come back down, and Clara had managed to get Noah to nap on a folded blanket in the corner of the linen room, the door propped just enough so she could hear him. It was Vivian Alcott who found her there at 10:23, after her supposed departure had been delayed by a phone call that ran long. Clara heard the heels first, a particular kind of heel that struck marble with intention, not just weight, and she turned from the linen shelf she was reorganizing in time to see Vivian appear in the doorway. Vivian was 29, beautiful in the way that required considerable effort and rewarded it with dark copper hair and the particular posture of someone who had decided long ago that rooms were made for her to stand in. She wore a cream blazer and held a small clutch under one arm, and she looked at Noah on his blanket the way a person looks at something that has been left somewhere inconvenient. "What?" Vivian said in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet. "Is that my nephew?" Clara kept her own voice level. "The daycare had an emergency closure this morning. Mrs. Gale approved." "I didn't ask what Mrs. Gale approved." Vivian's gaze moved from Noah to Clara, and it did not warm on the way. "I asked what it is doing in this house." Noah had woken at the sound of voices. He sat up, rubbing one eye, and looked at Vivian with the open, assessing stare that 2-year-olds deploy without strategy or mercy. Vivian looked back at him for a moment that went on slightly too long. Something shifting behind her expression, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it, before the controlled surface returned. "Get that child out of my sight, Clara." Vivian said each word placed with the care of someone setting down something fragile and dangerous. "And if he's still in this house when Ethan gets home, I will personally see to it that you never clean another toilet in this city again." Clara did not move. "Miss Alcott," she said, "my contract allows for emergency situations where childcare arrangements fall through. I've checked. Noah will stay in the staff area and won't be in any common—" "Your contract?" Vivian almost smiled. It did not reach her eyes, which were the pale gray-green of shallow water with no current. "You're going to quote your contract at me, in my house." "It's Mr. Whitmore's house," Clara said, and she said it very quietly, but she said it. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Vivian's jaw moved a small, careful adjustment, and then she turned and walked away without another word, her heels resuming their measured strike against the marble, fading down the corridor until they were gone. Clara exhaled slowly. Noah looked at the empty doorway for a moment, then held up his sippy cup, as if offering it to whatever had just left. Clara crouched down and pressed her forehead against his. "I know," she said in Spanish, which she always spoke to him when they were alone. "I know." She did not feel victorious. She felt the specific, nauseating vertigo of someone who has just stepped deliberately onto thin ice and is now required to walk. Ethan Whitmore came home at 6:15. Clara knew his arrival, not from the sound of his car. The garage was on the far side of the house, but from the change in the air pressure of the place. There was a house with Ethan and a house without Ethan, and they were different in the way a stage is different with and without its principal actor. Staff moved differently. Sounds organized themselves differently. Even the light in the foyer seemed to reconsider its angles. He was 34, not as tall as the house seemed to require of him, with dark hair worn close, and the kind of face that was more interesting than handsome angles, that suggested opinion, a line to the jaw that implied he had learned some things the hard way, and had not yet decided whether he regretted that. He came through the main hall, carrying a jacket over one arm and reading something on his phone, and he would have walked past the kitchen corridor entirely if Noah hadn't, at that precise moment, knocked his board book off the kitchen table with a sound like a small but definitive verdict. Ethan stopped. He looked into the kitchen. Noah looked back at him. "Hi," Noah said. Ethan blinked. He looked at Clara, who was standing at the counter and currently experiencing something she could only describe as the sensation of a trap door opening underneath her from a very great height. "Clara," he said, not unkindly, not warmly, simply as a fact. "There's a child in my kitchen." "Yes, sir. His daycare was closed. Mrs. Gale approved it this morning. He's my nephew. He'll be gone first thing tomorrow. The center expects to reopen." "It's fine." He looked back at Noah, who had now retrieved the board book and was examining it with the thoroughness of a quality control inspector. "How old?" 2 and 3 months. Ethan nodded slowly, something working behind his eyes that Clara couldn't read and didn't dare try to.
What's his name?
Noah. A pause. Something moved across Ethan's face, too fast to name, there and gone, like a cloud shadow on water. Noah, he repeated. Yes, sir. He looked at the boy for another moment, then at Clara, and then he nodded again and walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs. Clara stood very still until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Then she sat down on the nearest chair because her legs had decided quite independently that they were done for the moment. She had known this job was a risk. She had taken it anyway because she needed the salary and because the estate was 40 minutes from the neighborhood where anyone who had known her sister might recognize her face. She had told herself the risk was manageable. She had told herself she could keep Noah out of sight. She had told herself a lot of things over the past 2 years, most of them true. A few of them, the kind of truth that holds together only as long as you don't look at it straight on. She had not told herself what to do when Ethan Whitmore looked at Noah, and something in his expression went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. That night, after Noah was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime configuration of locked doors and dimmed lights, Clara went to retrieve a spare pillow from the hall closet adjacent to the storage room at the end of the staff corridor. The storage room was used for seasonal items, extra linens, boxed, decorations, sports equipment that no one seemed to actually use. She had been in it twice before, both times briefly. The third time, she noticed what she hadn't before. On the back of a cardboard box that had been pushed against the far wall, someone had written a name in black marker. Not a household inventory label, not a storage code. A name. Daniela Reyes. Her sister's name. Clara stood in the doorway of the storage room for a long time, the spare pillow pressed against her chest, the air around her tasting of dust and whatever it is that old cardboard smells like when it's been sitting undisturbed for months. She did not touch the box. She did not open it. She took the pillow and walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her cot and thought about the fact that someone in this house, not Mrs. Gale, who would have had no reason to know that name, not any of the kitchen staff, had written her dead sister's name on a box in a room that Clara was not supposed to have a reason to look in. She thought about Vivian's face when she'd looked at Noah. That pause, that fractional controlled thing that happened behind her eyes before the composure came back. She thought about what Ethan had said earlier, just before he'd gone upstairs. She'd nearly missed it because she'd been too focused on not visibly unraveling. But he'd paused in the kitchen doorway and said, almost to himself, I had the new security system installed last week. Whole house. Did Mrs. Gale mention that? Clara had said she hadn't heard, and he'd nodded and moved on. She lay down on her cot and stared at the ceiling and listened to Noah breathe. New security system. Whole house. She did not know yet what that meant. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that did not yet have a category, but were too important to lose. She was still awake at midnight when she heard footsteps in the main corridor above. Ethan's study was on the second floor, and the sound of a door closing with the careful quietness of someone who is making sure not to wake others, but is not themselves anywhere near sleep. The next morning, Clara rose at 5:30, which was 40 minutes before her scheduled start time, and made a point of having Noah fed and dressed and settled in the kitchen with his book and cereal before any other staff arrived. She was running on 3 hours of sleep, and the particular clarity that comes from having been frightened enough to stop pretending things are manageable. She had a job to do. She did it. She stripped the guest suite on the 3rd floor, turned the mattresses, relined the shelves in the master bathroom with fresh paper, and replaced the wilting flowers in the foyer with the new arrangement that had arrived from the florist. She moved through the house like someone who belongs in it by virtue of function rather than invitation, which is a specific kind of belonging that requires perfect execution and no mistakes. She was carrying a laundry basket through the first-floor corridor at 8 o'clock when Vivian came down the main staircase in a white silk robe and stopped at the bottom to look at her. "He's still here," Vivian said. "The center doesn't open until 9. I'll drop him off on my break." Vivian descended the last 2 steps with the deliberate pacing of someone who understands that space itself is a negotiating tool. She stopped close enough to Clara that Clara would have had to step back to maintain comfortable distance. Clara did not step back. "I want to be very clear about something," Vivian said, her voice at a register designed not to carry down the corridor in either direction. "This house is going to be mine in 4 months. When Ethan and I are married, the staff arrangements will be reviewed, and I can assure you that my staff will not be running a private daycare out of the linen room. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand that you have future plans," Clara said. "I'm here now, under the current arrangement." Vivian studied her for a moment with the cool, measuring attention of someone who is deciding not whether to strike, but when and how. "You're very calm for someone in your position," she said. "I try to be professional." "Is that what it is?" It was not a question. Vivian's gaze moved past Clara toward the kitchen, where the sound of Noah babbling quietly to himself was just barely audible. Something happened in her expression, again, that same complicated, controlled ripple before it settled back into smooth disinterest. "Tell me something, Clara." "Your sister. She worked in domestic service as well, didn't she?" The laundry basket nearly slipped. Clara's grip tightened and she held it, and she kept her face perfectly composed, and she said, "I'm not sure why my sister would be relevant to my employment." "Of course," Vivian said pleasantly. "It's not." She turned and walked toward the dining room. "Have the boy gone by 9. Clara stood in the corridor for the count of 10 breaths before she moved again. Vivian knew about Daniela. It was not a coincidence that the name was on a box in the storage room. It was not idle curiosity. Vivian had looked into Daniela specifically, which meant Vivian had looked into Clara specifically, which meant the job offer that had come through the agency 3 weeks ago with its unusually competitive rate and its immediate start date had not been a coincidence either. Clara had been placed here. She walked back to the kitchen, where Noah looked up at her arrival and said with great satisfaction, "Duck," pointing at a picture in his book. "Yes," Clara said, sitting down beside him. "Duck?" She watched his face and thought, with the focused animal clarity of someone calculating survival, about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the gap between those 2 things was likely to cost her. She dropped Noah at the reopened center at 9:15, kissed him twice on the forehead, and drove back to the estate through streets that were already warm with the particular dry heat of a Los Angeles summer morning. She had bought herself a day, possibly 2, before the next confrontation. She needed to use the time. Back at the estate, she did her work. She did all of it perfectly and without visible urgency, and at 2 in the afternoon she found a reason to be in the East Wing corridor where the household management office was located, and she stood at the filing cabinet she had legitimate access to for inventory purposes. And she found what she was looking for in 40 seconds. The domestic agency contract with its original request form clipped to the back. The request form was standard until the 3rd line under Specific Requirements, where someone had typed in a different font from the rest of the template. Prior connection to Daniela Reyes. December preferred. Clara photographed it with her phone and returned everything exactly as she'd found it. She thought on the drive to pick Noah up that evening about what it means when someone who wants to hurt you takes the time to make sure you're already inside the house first. She thought about the camera, the red light blinking in the upper corner of the storage room. She had noticed it when she was looking at the box. She had not touched anything. She had not done anything that would look wrong on camera. But she also now understood that somewhere in this house, footage was being recorded, and she did not know who was watching it or where it went. She decided for the moment to let that fact sit undisturbed, the way she'd let the box sit undisturbed, because some things you don't move until you know exactly where to put them. The daycare center was bright and smelled of paint and juice, and Noah ran to her across the room with the full-body commitment that only toddlers bring to reunions, crashing into her shins and grabbing her knees and looking up at her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. She picked him up. He put both hands on her face. "Car," he said with great urgency. "Yes," she said. "We're going to the car." She held him tighter than necessary on the walk to the parking lot, and she did not let herself think about the box with her sister's name on it, or the job request form, or the way Vivian had said, "your sister," in the corridor that morning, with the specific care of someone handling a blade. She let herself think only about the weight of the child in her arms, which was the most real thing she had, and the fact that she had gotten through today, which was something. Tomorrow she would figure out what came next. Tonight she would watch him eat dinner and give him his bath and read him the same 3 pages of the duck book 3 times, because that was what he wanted, and she would do all of it without letting the fear reach her face. That was the job. That had always been the job. Everything polished, nothing clean. 3 days after the kitchen encounter, Ethan Whitmore stood in his study at 11:15 in the evening and looked at a photograph he had not taken out in over a year. It was not framed. It had never been framed. It was printed on regular photo paper and had been folded once long ago, and the fold had made a pale crease through the center that divided the image in half with the imprecision of actual life. He had found it in the back of the right-hand drawer of his desk when he was looking for a USB cable, which was the kind of discovery that a person makes and then stands very still with for a while before deciding what to do. The photograph showed a woman laughing at something off camera. She was turned slightly to the left, her dark hair caught mid-movement, her hand raised as if she was about to say something or push her hair back. And the laugh was the real kind, the kind that forgets to be careful. She was 23 in the photograph. He remembered that. He remembered the afternoon, which had been in October, which had been 4 years ago, which had been 8 months before everything that came after. Her name had been Daniela. He had not said that name out loud in 3 years. He put the photograph back in the drawer and closed it, and he sat down in his chair and looked at the bookshelves for a while, and then he thought about the boy in his kitchen. 2 years and 3 months old, large, dark eyes, wide set, a very particular way of looking at things carefully before deciding how to feel about them, which was not an especially common trait in a 2-year-old, and which Ethan found himself cataloging with the involuntary precision of someone who does not yet know why they are paying attention to something, but knows enough to keep paying attention. The boy's name was Noah. Ethan opened his laptop and worked until 1 in the morning, and he did not let himself follow the thread. The campaign against Clara began on a Tuesday. It was not called a campaign. It was called a series of conversations, concerns, requests, and the particular kind of feedback that arrives not as accusation, but as worry, which is harder to defend against because it does not present itself as an attack. Vivian had, in the 3.5 years of her relationship with Ethan, become expert at the worry-shaped attack. She deployed it with the precision of someone who has studied the instrument and knows exactly how much pressure to apply. "I'm just a little concerned," she told Ethan on Tuesday evening, sitting across from him at the dining table with her wine glass held in both hands, in the way that communicated seriousness without alarm. "About some of the things Margaret mentioned." Margaret was the head of kitchen staff, a woman in her 60s who had worked for the Whitmores for 11 years, and who Clara would later understand owed Vivienne a favor that had not yet been named or collected. "What things?" Ethan said without looking up from his tablet. "Clara left a cleaning solution in an unlabeled bottle. Margaret nearly used it on the copper pots. And apparently she's been taking longer breaks than her schedule allows." Vivian set her wine glass down. "I know you want to give her the benefit of the doubt. I'm just saying we should be watching." Ethan looked up. "We can talk to Mrs. Gale." "Of course," Vivian smiled. "I already did. I wanted to make sure it was being addressed." She had not talked to Mrs. Gale. What she had done was speak to Margaret, who had spoken to the 2 junior staff members who were most dependent on Margaret's goodwill. And by Wednesday morning, Clara had been quietly reassigned to the tasks that were either most physically demanding or most systematically humiliating. Cleaning the outdoor furniture, which was done on one's knees on the patio. Scrubbing the utility room floor, which was in the basement and smelled of mold and old paint, and relabeling every single item in the household storage closets according to a new system that Vivian had suggested to Mrs. Gale, and that Mrs. Gale, understanding where the real authority in this house was migrating toward, had implemented without question. Clara did all of it without complaint, which was not the same as doing it without noticing. She noticed the reassignment. She noticed which tasks had been shuffled and which hadn't, and she noticed that the shuffling had begun the day after Vivienne had mentioned Daniela in the corridor. She noticed that Margaret, who had previously been civil, if not warm, was now civil in the specific way that means the warmth has been deliberately drained out, leaving only the surface. She noticed that the junior staff, 2 young women named Priya and Caitlin, had started eating their lunch break in the kitchen when Clara was eating hers in the corridor, which was a small rearrangement, but a legible one. She catalogued all of this the same way she catalogued the box in the storage room, and the job request form, and the camera with its small red light, carefully, without touching, waiting until she knew where to put it. On Thursday, she found the second piece. She was relabeling the shelves in the main storage closet on the 2nd floor. The new system required everything to be labeled by category, subcategory, and last used date. When she moved a stack of gift boxes from the lower shelf and found behind them a manila envelope that had slid back against the wall, it was not sealed. She told herself she should not open it. She opened it. Inside were printed pages, email correspondence formatted for printing, dated approximately 14 months ago. The emails were between Vivian and someone identified only as R.A. initials, no full name. And they discussed in the deliberately oblique language of people who are aware that written records exist, the process of confirming the connection between the Reyes family and the prior matter. One email referenced a hospital in Glendale. Another mentioned a DNA testing company by name, with a case number that had been partially redacted, but not carefully enough, because the last 4 digits were still visible. Clara read the emails 3 times. Her hands were steady. She was not sure how they managed that, but they were. Vivian had been trying to confirm whether Noah was Ethan's son, which meant Vivienne had suspected it or known it for at least 14 months, possibly longer, which meant the job offer through the agency, with its peculiar requirement about a prior connection to Clara Reyes, had been designed not to find a good housekeeper, but to draw Clara and Noah into a controlled environment where Vivian could gather information and manage the situation before it managed her. Clara replaced the envelope behind the gift boxes. She returned the gift boxes to their position. She finished relabeling the shelf. Her handwriting was steady. She went back to the staff quarters at lunch and sat in her room and thought. Vivian did not know for certain. If she had confirmed the DNA connection, she would not still be maneuvering. She would have already acted. The email chain was 14 months old, and whatever the testing company had found, it had either been inconclusive or the process had hit an obstacle, which meant Vivian was still in the gathering phase, still watching, still using Clara's presence in the house as a way to keep the question within arm's reach while she figured out how to answer it on her own terms. The question was, what would Vivian do if she stopped gathering and started acting? Clara thought about the storage room, the basement with its old lock and its single bare light bulb, and the camera in the upper corner. She thought about the kind of person who places a specific person in a specific house for a specific reason, and then waits. She thought, I need to be very careful about what I do next, and I need to be very careful about it before Vivian decides she's waited long enough. That evening, Ethan was in the kitchen when Clara came through to return the cleaning supplies she'd used on the patio furniture. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water, looking at something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in. You were out there in the heat all afternoon, he said. It was not quite a question. The teak needs to be oiled before the dry season, Clara said. I wanted to get it done. He looked at her for a moment. That wasn't on your regular assignment sheet. Mrs. Gale updated the assignments this week. Something in his expression changed. A small, almost imperceptible adjustment, the kind a person makes when a piece of information lands differently than they expected. He looked back at his phone. Then he said without looking up, How's your nephew? He get back to the daycare center all right? Yes, thank you for asking. Noah, Ethan said. Yes. He nodded slowly, turning the glass in his hand. Good name, he said to the counter more than to Clara. Then he put the glass in the sink and walked out, and Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment with the cleaning supplies in her hands and the particular feeling of being very close to something without being able to see its shape. She noticed on the way back through the corridor that a new panel had been installed beside the utility room door, small and brushed steel with a keypad, part of the security system Ethan had mentioned. She had not seen the installation, but the panel was there now, and the light on it was green. Recording. She walked past it without slowing her step. On Friday, Vivian told Mrs. Gale that she was concerned about items going missing from the master suite. She did not accuse Clara directly. She named no one. She said she had noticed that a small crystal dish from the bathroom counter, a decorative piece, nothing of significant value, the kind of thing that gets moved and forgotten, was not where she had left it, and that she would like the matter looked into, quietly, before it became anything larger. Mrs. Gale brought it to Clara in the manner of someone delivering news they wish they did not have to deliver, carefully, apologetically, and in a tone that communicated her own helplessness in the face of the architecture above her. She asked Clara if she had moved the dish. I cleaned the master bathroom on Monday, Clara said. I moved the dish to clean under it and put it back. I can show you exactly where. They went to the master bathroom together. The crystal dish was exactly where Clara said it would be, in the same position, undisturbed. Mrs. Gale nodded and said nothing, and looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who had been used as a tool and was beginning to understand it. "Mrs. Gale," Clara said quietly, "how long has Miss Alcott been suggesting changes to staff assignments?" Mrs. Gale said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that question, Clara, for both our sakes," and walked back out to the corridor. Which was, Clara understood, its own kind of answer. That night, she texted a number she had not texted in 8 months. Her cousin's boyfriend, who worked in security systems, and owed her a favor from a time she would not specify, and asked him one question. If a residential security system records footage, where does it go? Who has access? His reply came in 6 minutes. Depends on the system. Newer installs usually go to a private cloud tied to the primary account holder. Access is controlled by whoever set it up. She read that twice. Then she locked her phone and lay down next to Noah, who was asleep with one arm thrown over his face. And she thought about Ethan Whitmore installing a new security system across the whole house, and the footage going to a private cloud tied to the primary account holder, which was Ethan Whitmore, which meant that whatever the cameras in this house had recorded in the past 11 days, Ethan Whitmore could see it. She did not know whether this was a threat or a lifeline. She suspected in the careful and sleepless part of her mind that had been running calculations since the day she took this job that it might be both. What the walls remember. Ethan left for San Francisco on a Monday. He left early, before 6, which Clara knew not because she saw him go, but because the house rearranged itself around his absence in the way it always did. Quieter in some registers, louder in others. The particular pressure shift of a building that had organized its operational logic around one central axis and was now adjusting. She heard the car at 5:50. From the staff quarters window, the sound of it going down the drive, and then the gate, and then nothing. She stood at the window for a moment in the early dark, Noah still asleep behind her in the portable crib, and she thought, 2 days. He had said 2 days. She had 2 days to be in this house with Vivian, and no counterweight, which was not a new situation. Ethan was not, in any functional sense, a counterweight, since he was more consistently absent than present, and trusted his fiancée's version of events with the unquestioning faith of a man who has not yet learned to question it. But it was different now. The email chain in the storage closet, the crystal dish, the pattern of small strategic provocations, each one just plausible enough to be defended and just targeted enough to be a message. Clara dressed, put her hair up, and began the day. By noon, nothing had happened which Clara did not find reassuring. The absence of incident was one of Vivian's techniques. She had observed this over the past 2 weeks. Vivian did not escalate continuously. She escalated in periods, followed by false calm, which served the dual purpose of making the target doubt their own threat assessment and of choosing moments for action when the target had lowered their guard. The false calm was itself a tool. Clara collected Noah at his usual time, brought him back to the staff quarters, fed him lunch, and settled him for his afternoon nap. She had paperwork of her own to do. Her cousin's birthday was in 2 weeks, and she had been writing a card in installments, the way she did most things that required sustained emotion, a little at a time, so it didn't accumulate to unmanageable weight. She sat at her small desk and wrote 2 sentences of the card, and then stopped and looked at the wall. Somewhere in the house above her, she could hear Vivian's heels. The heels moved from the main corridor to the east wing, which contained the formal sitting rooms, and beyond them, the door to the basement staircase. Clara tracked the sound with the involuntary attention of a prey animal, registering movement in peripheral vision, and she told herself she was being paranoid. And then she heard the sound of a door being opened, and more specifically, a sound she recognized. The particular resistance of the basement door, which had a sticky hinge that she had submitted a maintenance request about on her second day, and which had not yet been fixed. She heard it open. And then she heard, faintly but unmistakably, Noah's voice saying something in his sleep. No. She realized her mistake a half-second before her body did. Noah's voice, coming from the staff quarters where he was asleep, would not be audible from the corridor outside the basement door, which meant the sound she'd heard, small, half-formed, 2-year-old noise, was not coming from behind her. She turned around. The portable crib was empty. The next 4 minutes were the kind that Clara would not be able to remember in sequence afterward, only in images. The crib with its disarranged blanket. The door to her room, which she knew she had left ajar, but which was now standing fully open. The corridor empty in both directions. The sound of her own footsteps, which seemed to belong to someone moving much faster than she was aware of moving. She checked the kitchen, the laundry room, the utility room, the small bathroom at the end of the staff corridor. She moved efficiently and without calling out, because something in her, the part that had been running calculations for 2 weeks, the part that had read the email chain and photographed the request form, understood that calling out was not what this situation required. What this situation required was finding Noah before she let herself know what she was afraid of. She went up the service stairs to the main floor. The east wing corridor was empty. The sitting room doors were closed. At the far end of the corridor, the basement door was shut, but the sticky hinge had left its mark on the air, a slight resistance in the temperature, the way a door recently opened changes the air current in a hall. Clara walked to the basement door and pressed her palm flat against it, and stood there for a second that stretched out like something being pulled. Then she heard it. From below, through the door, muffled by the distance and the thickness of the door and the stone of the basement walls, a small voice. Not crying, more puzzled than distressed, the particular vocalization of a toddler who is in a place they do not understand, and is announcing this fact to whoever might be listening. "Mama." A pause. "Mama." Clara had the basement door open before she had decided to open it. The light switch at the top of the stairs was missing its cover plate. Another maintenance issue, weeks old, and she hit the switch with the flat of her hand and went down the stairs without waiting to see if it had worked, navigating by the thin light from the main floor behind her. The basement was a single large room, divided by old wooden shelving units into 3 sections, seasonal storage on the left, utility equipment in the center, and a smaller section on the right that was used for wine and preserved foods. The single overhead bulb was on. In the corner of the right-hand section, Noah was sitting on the cold concrete floor, having apparently found a wine rack of sufficient interest to occupy him, holding an empty bottle by the neck and examining it with the concentrated focus of someone who has found something strange and wonderful. He looked up when he heard Clara on the stairs. "Bottle," he said by way of explanation. Clara crossed the room in 7 steps and picked him up, the bottle still in his hands, because removing it would take more emotional composure than she had in this particular second, and she held him against her chest and put her face against his hair, and stood there. He patted her shoulder with the hand not holding the bottle, which was his way of communicating general goodwill. Then she looked up. In the upper corner of the right-hand section, above the wine rack, angled to cover most of the room, was a small camera, brushed steel housing, red indicator light blinking in a slow, steady rhythm, the rhythm of something recording continuously, rather than triggered by motion. She had not noticed it before. She had been in the basement twice and had not looked up. She looked at it now. She looked at it for a long time, the camera and its blinking red eye. And she thought about the security system Ethan had installed the previous week, covering the whole house footage going to a private cloud tied to the primary account holder. She thought about the fact that the camera was on, that it was recording, that it had been recording for whatever length of time Noah had been down here, and for however long before that. She thought about the basement door with its sticky hinge. She had not brought Noah down here. She had not left her room door open wide enough for a 2-year-old to wander freely. She was certain of that. She had learned 3 days after bringing Noah home from the hospital 2 years ago that you do not leave doors open when you have a mobile toddler, and the lesson had been permanent. The door had been opened from outside. Someone had opened Clara's room door, had taken or led Noah from the staff quarters, had brought him to the basement, and the camera had seen it. She did not move toward it. She did not gesture at it or acknowledge it in any way that would register on the recording as acknowledgement. She simply stood in the basement with Noah in her arms, and she looked at the camera once, steadily. And then she carried Noah back up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, she almost walked into Vivienne. Vivienne was standing in the corridor outside the now open basement door, wearing a linen dress and holding her phone loosely at her side, and her expression was one Clara had not seen on her before. Not the controlled surface pleasantness, not the deliberate worry-shaped cruelty, but something rawer and more unstable. The expression of someone who has just had a plan go sideways and is recalculating its speed. He wandered, Vivienne said. He's 2, Clara said. He can't open a deadbolt. The basement door doesn't have a deadbolt. It has a handle he can't reach, and a door that requires 40 pounds of force to push open. I know, because I filed a maintenance request about the hinge. Clara's voice was level. She shifted Noah on her hip and kept her eyes on Vivienne's face. I found him on the basement floor. The light was on. The door was open. You shouldn't have left him unattended. I was at my desk. He was asleep in his crib. Someone opened my room door. Clara held Vivienne's gaze for 1 precise second. Someone who isn't 2 years old and 4 feet tall. Vivienne looked at her, and then something happened that Clara had not expected. Instead of the controlled pivot, instead of the next escalation, Vivienne's expression broke briefly and imperfectly into something that looked almost like fear. It lasted less than a second, and it was gone, replaced immediately by the familiar composure, but it had been there. I'd like you to think very carefully, Vivienne said quietly, about what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Clara said. I'm telling you what I found. She walked past Vivienne and back toward the staff quarters, and she did not turn around, because turning around would have required her to look at Vivienne's face again, and she could not afford to do that while she was also holding Noah and keeping her voice steady and understanding all the implications of a camera in a basement that had just recorded something Vivienne did not know was being recorded. She put Noah down in his crib. He had miraculously fallen asleep in the walk from the basement to the staff quarters, still holding the wine bottle, and she pried it gently from his fingers and set it aside, and pulled the blanket over him, and sat down on the edge of her cot. From somewhere upstairs, she heard Vivienne's voice. A phone call. The tone sharp and low, the words indistinct. Then silence. Then the sound of heels on the main staircase, going up, not coming down. Then, 10 minutes later, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Reyes? Ethan Whitmore's voice, precise and quiet, and stripped of all the careful social lubrication it usually carried. "I need you to tell me what happened this afternoon." Clara closed her eyes, opened them. "How much of it did you see?" she asked. A pause. Then, "All of it." Every lie has a frame rate. He had been in a conference room on the 37th floor of a building in the financial district when his phone had sent the alert. The security system was set to notify him if footage in any restricted zone of the house, the study, the basement, the safe room behind the library, showed activity during an unscheduled window. He had set it up this way 3 weeks ago, not because of any concern about Clara or the household staff, but because 18 months of being engaged to Vivian Alcott had taught him in the slow and undramatic way that important lessons often arrive, that certain things in his house were being moved, accessed, or copied without his knowledge. Documents primarily, files from his study. He had never been able to prove it and had told himself he was paranoid. But the paranoia had eventually won the argument, and he had called a security firm and had the system installed. On a Thursday, when Vivian was in New York, and the staff had been told it was a routine upgrade. The basement was flagged as restricted because of the wine collection, and a secondary reason he had not examined too closely, which was that it was the room in his house he was least able to account for, and therefore most needed to be able to see. When the alert came through with a thumbnail of activity in the basement zone, he had been mid-sentence in a discussion about a port acquisition on the Texas Gulf Coast. He had looked at the thumbnail, small, imprecise, but showing 2 figures, one large and one very small, and had excused himself and gone to the corridor and sat down on a chair by the elevator bay and pulled up the live feed. He watched for 11 minutes. He watched Vivian Alcott open the door to Clara's staff quarters, and with the brisk efficiency of someone performing a task they had thought through in advance, lift a sleeping toddler from a portable crib, carry him to the basement staircase, set him down at the top of the stairs, and nudge him gently, not roughly, not violently, with the calculated gentleness of someone who understands that marks are inconvenient toward the stairs, and then step back and pull the basement door nearly closed, leaving it ajar by a margin that a 2-year-old would interpret as an invitation. He watched Noah navigate the basement stairs slowly and with great concentration, one hand on each step. He watched Noah sit on the basement floor and find the wine bottle. He watched the timestamp increment for 23 minutes before Clara appeared on the stairs. He watched all of it. When the live feed showed Clara coming back up the stairs with Noah in her arms, Ethan was already standing in the corridor outside the conference room with his phone pressed to his ear and his jacket in his other hand, and his assistant was rescheduling the rest of the afternoon's meetings without being told to, because she had worked for him for 6 years and she could read his face through a conference room window. "I need you to tell me what happened this afternoon." Clara's voice on the phone was controlled in the specific way of someone who has been keeping things controlled for a very long time and is now controlling whether to keep controlling them, which was a different and more complicated version of the same effort. When he asked her how much she'd seen, he could hear the calibration in the pause before she answered. She was deciding in real time what the right answer was, what the safe answer was. "All of it," he said, before she could answer, because he did not want her to have to make that decision. Another pause, shorter this time. "Then you know what happened." "I know what I saw. I want to hear what you know." What she told him in the next 18 minutes, standing in her room in his house, while his nephew slept in a portable crib next to her, was not everything. He understood that. She told him about the basement, about Noah, about the conversation with Vivian in the corridor afterward. She did not tell him about the box in the storage room with a name on it, or the manila envelope behind the gift boxes, or what either of those things had meant to her. She kept those things to herself with the practiced tightness of someone who has learned that information once given cannot be retrieved, and who is not yet certain what giving it would cost. He did not push. He made a note of what she wasn't saying, which was almost as informative as what she was saying. And he told her he would be back tomorrow morning. And he told her to lock her room door. And he said with a formality that he recognized as a placeholder for things he wasn't ready to say yet, "Thank you for calling me." "You called me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did." He hung up and stood in the corridor for a long time, looking at nothing, doing the kind of arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers. He came back at 9 the next morning instead of the afternoon as planned. He came back with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Patricia Vance, and she was a partner at a firm that Ethan had retained for 7 years, and that Vivian had, on 3 separate occasions, suggested he replace with a firm of her choosing. He had not replaced her. Patricia Vance was 61 years old and had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every human situation and was no longer surprised by any of them, only interested. And Ethan had always found this quality in her more reassuring than any alternative. He did not bring Patricia inside immediately. He went into the house alone first. Vivian was in the morning room with coffee and a laptop, and she looked up when he came in and said with only the briefest flicker of recalibration, "You're early. I thought you weren't coming back until this afternoon." "Change of plans," he said. He sat down across from her and put his phone on the table between them, face up with the security system app open and the footage from the previous afternoon queued to the relevant timestamp. He pressed play and let it run for 45 seconds, which was long enough, and then he stopped it. Vivian looked at the phone. She did not look at Ethan. She looked at the phone with the specific attention of someone who was receiving information they already had but had not expected to have confirmed. And the quality of her silence was not the silence of innocence or shock, but the silence of tactical reorientation. "That looks worse than it is," she said. "It looks like what it is," Ethan said. "I have 45 minutes of footage. I'm going to need you to help me understand how it looks better than I think it does." Vivian set her coffee cup down. She folded her hands on the table, and the gesture was so precisely composed, so consciously deliberate, that Ethan felt something he had been letting himself not feel for a considerable amount of time. The specific, cold clarity of a man who has been believing what was convenient and has just run out of room for it. "She shouldn't have had the child in this house," Vivian said. "You know that. The arrangement was an emergency daycare closure, which you were informed of, which Mrs. Gale approved." He kept his voice level. "I'm not talking about the childcare arrangement. I'm talking about what you did in my house with someone else's child." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that complicated multi-layered calculation. And then she made a decision. He could see her make it the shift from defensive to strategic, and he thought, there it is. The thing he had been not seeing for 18 months. "You want to know what I did?" she said, and her voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but different in a way that removed the careful wrapping from something underneath. "I managed a problem, Ethan. The way I've been managing problems since the beginning of this arrangement, because you were too busy or too distracted or too—" She stopped, recalibrated, came back at a lower temperature. "I was protecting us. From a 2-year-old. From his mother. from what she represents. Vivian picked up her coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. Clara Reyes is not just a housekeeper, Ethan. She is Daniela Reyes's sister. And before you tell me you don't know who that is, I think you do. The sound of his ex-wife's sister's name. No, not ex-wife. Not even close to that. Something without a clean name in Vivian's mouth, delivered in that tone of compressed certainty, was one of the stranger things Ethan had experienced in a year of strange experiences. He felt it land with the particular weight of information that has been withheld for too long, hitting a surface that was not prepared for it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Vivian set the cup down. "Long enough to know that if that child turns out to be who I think he is, everything we've been building, the merger, the family arrangement with my father's company, the public image we've spent 2 years constructing, all of it gets complicated in ways that don't serve either of us. I was trying to manage it. I was trying to give you a way out of a situation you didn't know you were in. By locking a 2-year-old in a basement. By creating a situation where Clara would choose to leave." Her voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who has found their ground and is standing on it. "I was not going to hurt the child, Ethan. I'm not. You put a 2-year-old alone in a basement, on a concrete floor, without telling anyone, for 23 minutes. Each sentence was a fact placed separately without emphasis, which was worse than anger. "Whatever you intended, those are the facts." Vivian looked at him, and he looked back, and he thought that he could see for the first time, with full clarity, that the woman he had been planning to marry was someone he did not, in any meaningful sense, know. He had known the performance. He had been watching the performance and calling it a person, and the performance was very good. But he had just seen what was underneath it on a 45-second video clip, and the underneath was not good. "I'm going to need you to leave," he said. "Ethan, not from this room, from this house, today." He picked up his phone. "Patricia Vance is outside. She's going to facilitate the process of dissolving the engagement. I'd like you to cooperate with that, and I'd like you to do it without making this more complicated than it needs to be." Vivian's composure, which had held through everything, cracked fractionally. Not broke, cracked in the way that implies the person is aware the crack is visible and is including the visibility of it as part of their next move. "If you do this," she said, "I will tell every media outlet in this city that Noah is your illegitimate son and that you knew and concealed it. I will make this story so complicated and so public that you will spend the next 3 years doing nothing but managing it. You don't have proof of that. I have 14 months of a DNA investigation that I can describe in enough detail to make it a story, regardless of the result." She paused. "And I have the fact that you are currently handing your housekeeper's nephew a glass of water in your kitchen instead of calling the police, which is not how an innocent man who had no idea what was going on behaves." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The footage I have is enough to pursue criminal charges for child endangerment. If you'd like to have a conversation about what either of us plans to do publicly, we can do that. But my first call is going to be to the police, not to a publicist, which means you do not have the window you think you have." He stood up. "Patricia is outside. She's very good at her job. I'd suggest you talk to her." He walked out of the morning room and down the corridor to the kitchen, where Clara was standing at the counter with Noah on her hip, and the look on her face when she saw him was not relief. It was the specific, braced expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for the next thing to happen, and is still not certain it will be good. "There are things I need to tell you," he said, "and I think there are things you need to tell me." Clara looked at him. Noah looked at him. The morning light came through the kitchen windows and lay across the tile floor in long, pale bars, and the house was very quiet. "Yes," Clara said. "There are. The truth doesn't need your permission." Patricia Vance was, as Ethan had said, very good at her job. What he had not specified was that very good in Patricia's case meant that she had been standing on the front steps of the Whitmore estate for 40 minutes, phone in one hand and coffee in the other, and had used that time to contact 2 colleagues, review the relevant California statutes on child endangerment and domestic partnership dissolution, and compose a text to a former client who happened to be a deputy district attorney with whom she played tennis on alternate Fridays. By the time Ethan came to the front door and told her that Vivian was in the morning room and ready to discuss terms, Patricia already knew considerably more than Vivian would have preferred. Vivian, however, was not ready to discuss terms. What Vivian was ready to do was fight. She had spent the 11 minutes since Ethan left the morning room doing what she did when the performance failed. She stripped it back entirely and went to the thing underneath, which was not cruelty, as Ethan seemed to have concluded, but fear. She was afraid of a very specific and non-abstract set of things: the loss of the Whitmore connection, which was the thing her father's business needed, and which was the reason the engagement had been pursued with such singular focus over the past 3 years, the public exposure of the investigation she had commissioned into Clara Reyes, which she had undertaken without Ethan's knowledge, and using funds that had been, in a technical and uncomfortable sense, partially his. And underneath both of those things, the oldest and most structural fear, the one she had been running from since the age of 17, which was the fear of being the person who could be left behind. She had spent her entire adult life building a position that could not be left behind, and now it was being left behind, and she had 45 minutes of video working against her, and her options had narrowed to one: make the cost of removing her higher than the cost of keeping her. She had her phone out when Patricia walked in. "Miss Alcott," Patricia said, sitting down across from her without being invited, setting a slim leather folder on the table and looking at Vivian with the particular brand of alert neutrality that Vivian recognized as the professional equivalent of a weapon already drawn. "I appreciate you being available on short notice." "I'm going to make a phone call," Vivian said, "before we talk about anything." "Of course. Though I should mention that Mr. Whitmore's security system records all activity in the house, including this room, which he has flagged as a monitored zone. If that's relevant to who you're calling, you may want to choose a different location." Patricia opened her folder. "My preference is that we use the next hour productively. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to approach this dissolution privately, without involving law enforcement or the press, provided certain conditions are met. If that window closes, the approach changes." Vivian put her phone face down on the table. "What conditions?" she said. "A signed statement acknowledging the events of yesterday afternoon and their characterization under California Penal Code, Section 273, subsection A. A mutual non-disclosure agreement with teeth, and the return of any documents, digital or physical, obtained from or about the Whitmore household that were not obtained with explicit authorization." Patricia looked up from the folder. "That last one is important. Mr. Whitmore is aware that materials were accessed from his study over the past 14 months. He'd prefer a clean transfer over a discovery process." Vivian's jaw moved. "He doesn't have evidence of that. He has a security system that went live 18 days ago and a lawyer who's been practicing for 31 years. Patricia's tone did not change. "Miss Alcott, I have done dissolution agreements for 2 senators, a sitting federal judge, and a man who owned 4 professional sports franchises simultaneously. I am not here to humiliate you or to perform a power dynamic for the room. I am here to close this in a way that does not require courts, cameras, or depositions. Whether that option remains available depends entirely on what you do in the next 30 minutes. The silence in the morning room was the kind that has texture. Vivian looked at the leather folder. She looked at her phone face down on the table. She thought about her father's company and the Whitmore connection and the fear that had been running her since she was 17, and she thought about Noah in the basement. And for the first time since she had made that particular decision, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. Not the moral weight, but the strategic weight. The weight of a choice that had looked like control and turned out to be the opposite. "I want independent legal counsel," she said. "That's your right, and I encourage it," Patricia said. "I'll step out while you make the call. The offer, as stated, will remain open until noon. After noon, the filing goes to the DA's office." She stood, closed the folder, and walked to the door. Then she paused without turning around. "Ms. Alcott, whatever you were afraid of, it would have been better to have been afraid of the cameras." She stepped out. Vivian sat alone in the morning room and looked at the morning light coming through the windows and pressed her hands flat on the table and thought, with a clarity she had not felt in years, that she had made a very large mistake at the center of a very long and complicated plan, and that the mistake was not that she had been caught. The mistake was much older than that. She had made it the day she decided that keeping something was more important than deserving it. She picked up her phone and called her own lawyer. It took 3 hours. Vivian's lawyer arrived at 11:15, a compact and unhurried man named Russell, who had the look of someone who specialized in situations that other lawyers found uncomfortable. He and Patricia sat across the dining room table from each other for 2 hours and 20 minutes and negotiated with the careful, bloodless efficiency of professionals who respect each other's competence without finding it pleasant. Vivian sat at the far end of the table and said very little, which was the single best decision she had made all morning. The agreement they reached included the statement, the NDA, and the return of materials. It did not include the DA filing, which Patricia withdrew conditionally, pending compliance. It also included a clause that Vivian's lawyer argued against and eventually conceded: a permanent restriction on any public statement regarding the personal or familial circumstances of Ethan Whitmore or any member of his household, current or future. Current or future. Clara's phrase from when she'd signed her own employment contract came back to her: the current arrangement. She had said it to Vivian in the corridor with such precise calm, and Vivian had found it infuriating, and she found it now sitting at the dining table, signing her name on the last page of a document that she had spent 3 years trying to make unnecessary, something closer to apt. At 2:15, Vivian left the Whitmore estate in a car that her own assistant had called. She did not take the things she had brought to the house over the 18 months of an increasingly permanent residency in single trips. Those would be arranged through counsel. She took her phone, her bag, and the particular expression of someone who has lost the thing they spent the longest time fighting for, which is not an expression that has a clean name, but which is recognizable to anyone who has ever seen it. Patricia watched the car go from the front steps, and then turned and walked back inside. "Well," she said to Ethan, who was standing in the foyer, "that's the first part." "Yes," Ethan said. He was looking at the drive, not at Patricia. "I know." Clara had not watched any of it. She had been in the staff quarters with Noah for the 3 hours it took to negotiate the agreement, and she had not left except once at noon to make Noah a lunch of crackers and cheese and apple slices that she arranged on the tray with more care than the occasion required, because she needed something to do with her hands. She had been given no information about what was happening and had not asked for any. She had cleaned her room. She had reread the duck book 4 times. She had packed her bag. The packing was not a decision she had made out loud. It was the decision her hands had made on their own, while the rest of her was occupied with keeping Noah from putting the television remote in his mouth. And when she noticed she was doing it, she stopped and looked at the bag and thought about what it meant that her first instinct in a situation where she might have been vindicated was to prepare to leave. She knew what it meant. She had been preparing to leave since she took this job. She had been preparing to leave since the day she moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Glendale with a 3-day-old baby that wasn't hers, and told herself she was just getting through the first month. She had been preparing to leave for 2 years because leaving was the thing she knew how to do, and staying, with all its requirements of trust and presence and the willingness to be known, was the thing she did not know how to do without her sister there to tell her it was all right. At 2:30, someone knocked on her door. She opened it. Ethan was in the corridor. He had taken off his jacket at some point and was in shirt sleeves, and he looked tired in the way that goes beyond the physical, the kind of tired that comes from having spent a significant portion of the day doing something that required you to dismantle your previous understanding of your own life. "Vivian is gone," he said. Clara looked at him. "Gone? As in?" "Gone. The engagement is dissolved. Patricia is handling the remaining details." He leaned against the corridor wall, not in a casual way, but in the way of someone who has been standing with their weight in the wrong place and has just made an adjustment. "I want to tell you what I know, and I want to ask you some things. And I think it's fair to warn you that some of what I'm going to ask—" He stopped, started again. "Some of what I'm going to ask is going to be hard to hear answered. I'm asking anyway, because I'd rather know a hard thing than not know it." Clara looked at the man in the corridor, this person who had been a name on a contract, a presence the house organized itself around, a fact she had been managing around for 32 days, and she thought about the packed bag on her cot, and she thought about her sister, and she thought about Noah, who was currently in his crib behind her, making a sound like a small motor engine because he was imitating a book about trucks. "You should come in," she said. They sat at the small table in her room, which was designed for 1 person, and managed 2 badly, with Noah between them on the floor, with his truck book and a small set of stackable cups that he was deploying as a construction project of considerable ambition. The room smelled of apple slices and the laundry detergent she used on Noah's clothes, and it was the most ordinary and most significant room Ethan Whitmore had ever sat in. He told her what he knew first, which was the right order. He told her about the security system and why he'd installed it, and what he'd seen on the footage. And he watched her face while he said it, not the face she usually showed in the common areas of the house. Composed, efficient, present, without being visible. But the face she had when she was not performing, which was more tired and more real, and more capable of registering pain than the professional one. He told her about the morning room, and Vivian, and Patricia, and the agreement. He told her that the footage was backed up, and that it was his to keep, and that if she wanted to be involved in any subsequent legal proceedings, she had that right, and he would support it. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. Noah stacked 3 cups, knocked them over, and made a sound of profound satisfaction. When Ethan was done, he looked at her and he said, "Now, the thing I need to ask you Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already know." "I think I do. I've thought I did for 32 days, and I've been trying very hard not to think it, which is—" He stopped. "Which is a habit I'm apparently going to have to work on." She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at Noah. He was concentrating on a stack of 4 cups, tongue slightly out, the full weight of his attention on the problem of balance. He had her sister's patience. He had her sister's way of forgetting the room when something interested him. He also had, in a way, she'd been aware of and cataloging and refusing to name since the first day she walked into this house. A line to the jaw that did not come from Daniela, and a certain quality of stillness when he looked at new things that she recognized from the man sitting across from her. "His name is Noah Reyes," Clara said. "His mother was my sister Daniela. She died of a postpartum complication 4 days after he was born. I've been his primary caregiver since he was 3 days old." Ethan said nothing. "My sister worked in this house," Clara said, "before me. For about 7 months, 3 years ago. The agency placed her. She stopped, looked up. "You don't remember her?" It was not a question, but Ethan answered it anyway. "I remember her," he said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him, lower and more careful. The register of someone picking their way through a space they know has changed, but can't yet see the full extent of. There was a period. It was brief. There were things I should have done differently in terms of how it ended. The family had—" He stopped. "My mother had opinions about what was appropriate. I was 30. I was wrong to listen to her." Clara looked at him. "Did you know about the pregnancy?" "No." The word was immediate and certain and without deflection. "I did not know. I would not have, no." She believed him. She had not expected the believing to feel the way it did, which was like something releasing pressure it had been under for 2 years, and which was also frightening, because it meant she was revising the story she had been telling herself, and the story she had been telling herself was the scaffolding she had been holding everything up with. "How did you end up here?" Ethan asked. "In this house, this specific job?" "Someone requested me." She told him about the agency request form. She told him about the box in the storage room with Daniela's name, the manila envelope with the email chain, the DNA investigation that Vivian had apparently been running for 14 months. She told him all of it steadily, with the relief of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for too long, and has found that the act of putting it down, even into uncertain hands, is worth the vulnerability. When she was done, Ethan looked at the floor for a long moment. "Vivian drew you in," he said. "She placed you here so she could manage the situation before it reached me." "Yes." "And you came because—" "I needed the job." She met his eyes. "And because I thought if I was close, I could see what was happening. I could know what I was dealing with." A pause. "I didn't account for it going this way." "Neither did I." He looked at Noah, who had achieved a stack of 5 cups and was now staring at it with the focused satisfaction of someone who has arrived at a conclusion after considerable effort. "He has her patience," Ethan said quietly. "Yes. And other things." He said it carefully, not as a claim, as a recognition. "Yes," Clara said. The silence that followed was the kind that is not empty, but full of the weight of 2 years of a child existing without his father's knowledge, and the weight of a woman who died without seeing what happened next, and the weight of a man who had been told a version of his own life that had a significant piece missing from it. It was a heavy silence. It held its own ground without any help. "I don't want him to leave," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. He ran a hand over his face, and the gesture was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do. The performance of capability temporarily offline. I understand that I am functionally a stranger to him, and that you are the person who has been there. I'm not saying anything about that changes. I'm saying—" He stopped, looked at her directly. "I would like a chance to be someone he knows, and I would like to do that in whatever way is right for him and for you." Clara looked at the man across the small table in her small room, and she looked at Noah on the floor, and she thought about the bag she had packed, and she thought about the 2 years of managing things alone, and she thought about what it would mean to stop managing and start something else, something that required a different kind of courage. "I haven't told you everything yet," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "There's more about the investigation, the materials I found. I kept copies." She watched his face. "I wasn't sure whose side you'd be on." He held her gaze steadily. "I understand why you weren't sure." "I need to know." She stopped, started again. "I need to know what happens next for Noah. I need to know that the conversation about his father doesn't become a conversation about custody lawyers and court filings and who has the resources to outlast who in a legal process, because that is a conversation I cannot win, and you know that." Her voice was even. "If that's where this is going, I need to know now." "That's not where this is going," Ethan said. "That's what you say today." "It's what I'll say with Patricia in the room. It's what I'll say in writing if that's what you need." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table, the posture of someone who is not performing reassurance, but is trying to actually provide it, which is different and takes more effort. "Clara, you brought him here. You kept him safe. Whatever my rights are in a legal sense, and I'm not sure I've earned the right to invoke them with any particular conviction right now, what I actually want is for him to have people who love him. You're on that list. I'm upon the weight of an honest uncertainty. I'm not on it yet, but I'd like to try to be." Noah looked up from his cups. He looked at Ethan with the wide, assessing, unhurried gaze he brought to new things, the full weight of his attention. No strategy, no performance, just looking. Then he picked up one of the cups and held it out. Ethan looked at the cup. Then he reached across the floor and took it. "Thank you," he said to Noah. Noah said very seriously, "Cup." "Yes," Ethan said. "Cup." Clara watched this exchange and felt something move through her that she did not have a word for. Not quite hope, not quite grief, not quite relief, but something that was related to all three and was its own thing. It felt like the ending of a version of things and the very tentative beginning of a different version. And she did not know yet what the different version would look like. And that was frightening in a way that was also somehow less frightening than what had come before. "I'm not ready to trust you," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I am just because today went the way it did. I wouldn't want you to." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Between them, Noah restacked his cups with quiet industriousness, apparently satisfied that the cup-sharing portion of the meeting had concluded, and it was time to return to construction. "I'll stay through the end of the contract month," Clara said. "We can talk about what happens after that." "All right. And I want Patricia Vance's direct number." Despite everything, something moved across Ethan's face that was almost a smile. I'll text it to you. Clara nodded. She looked down at Noah. She thought about her sister, who would have had several very pointed things to say about this entire situation, most of them accurate, and at least one of them funny. And she thought about the fact that the thing she had been most afraid of, Noah being taken from her, the world of the Whitmores closing around him and shutting her out, had not happened, had in fact been averted by a camera in a basement that had been installed for a completely different reason, which was the kind of thing Daniela would have called the universe showing off. She would have had a lot to say about this, Clara said, half to herself. Your sister? Yes. She paused. She would have liked that it was cameras. She thought she always said that the truth doesn't need your permission. It just needs long enough. Ethan was quiet for a moment. She was right, he said. The light in the room had shifted to the particular amber of late afternoon, warm and low, the kind that makes even small rooms look like they have some grace to them. Noah had accomplished a tower of 6 cups and was now looking at it with an expression of severe professional evaluation. The house was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, not the taut, managed quiet of a place where someone is controlling the silence, but the quieter quiet of a place where the thing that had been wound too tight had just finally let go. It was not a resolution. Clara knew this. There would be lawyers and conversations and questions and processes, and days where she would wonder whether she had made the right call, and days where she would know she had, and days where she would not be able to tell the difference. There would be Noah to explain things to in the future, in age-appropriate increments, and the explaining would be its own long and particular labor. There would be a lot of things. But the secret was no longer a secret, and the camera had done what cameras do, which is to witness without opinion. And the footage was backed up in a private cloud, tied to an account that was, for reasons no one had entirely planned, on her side. She looked at Ethan Whitmore, who was sitting on the floor of her small room, helping a 2-year-old restack a collection of plastic cups. And she thought, I don't know you yet. And she thought, I don't know what this becomes. And she thought, because her sister's voice was always available to her when she needed it most. But you're still here. That's something. She was still here. That was something.